All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we tend to focus on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, um, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and grand unified theories, but in any rate, usually very obscure and um, targeted toward helping us out with uh, our present tense, our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our formation of a holistic worldview, our quest for better spiritual, physical, and mental health. And we just finished reading the book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha from Dr. Daniel Ingram. And that was the first reading in a unit here that I'm calling the Reciprocal Church. And it hopefully gives kind of alternative, syncretic ways of feeling the spirit, getting into spiritual evolution, and I will be presenting later more conclusive proof that we're going to need to reformulate our Western traditions, our Western religions, to be a little bit more inclusive, because what we're working with is fraudulent and booby-trapped. So we're going to start this one here, which is called "It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet?" Subtitled Black Creative Music in Chicago, 1950 to 1980. And this isn't too long, and then hopefully by then I will be ready to go into fairly in-depth kind of Bible study. And this is interesting in that a lot of it is about a guy named Sun Ra, who was a band leader, but he was also, his quest was to discover the true meaning of the Bible. And he claimed that he found that, and that he would say, "I found out what the truth is, and it is a bad truth." I don't believe that Ra was able to articulate, at least in words, to anybody beyond his band, at least, what his actual, code breaking of the Bible entailed. But that's what he did say. It is a code. It's not a good book. It is a code book. And so we're going to be getting into that after we get done with this. We're going to try to break the codes, plural, of the Bible, and then use the pieces left over to help us syncretize a new Western spiritual tradition. Okay, here's the introduction. "It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet?" was a chant that bandleader Sun Ra used to tease his audiences with, chiding them for sleeping all the way through Armageddon. Due to various events in his life, Sun Ra's end of the world occurred during the 1930s, and from then on he began to live in a mysterious future world of space. Sun Ra's multimedia spectacle concerts were spiced with group chants, many of them about space. The music was often far out, too, with hypnotic drumming, unexpected harmonies, long improvisations, blaring dissonant horns, and Sun Ra making the piano or any number of electronic keyboards produce otherworldly sounds. What was Sun Ra trying to do? This question has stumped most inquiries of Sun Ra and his band, the Orchestra. That's orchestra with an A-R-K. Most commentators have not taken him seriously, and they do not take him literally when he proclaims that he is trying to shock them, the humans, out of their slumber. The Sun Ra Orchestra and their successors in the AACM, which stands for the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, have been written about as artists and as professional musicians, but they have not been written in the role that the musicians had taken on for themselves as revivalists of the traditional role of African musicians. As servants of their people, as oracles, prophets, holistic healers, and spiritual teachers, musicians in the Sun Ra Orchestra and the AACM tried diverse creative methods to reinsert a sacred dimension into their music. In this work, I employ creative to mean an act of striving to follow the example of the creator of the universe. When musicians are being creative, they are producing something that did not exist before, and they are tapping into the divine aspects of themselves. Moreover, through their musical objects of creativity, the musicians can assist listeners to access the divine within themselves. Thus, creative music serves as a path from the secular to the spiritual. Implicit in this formulation of creativity is that we are all co-creators of this universe, and that the power to create lies inside all of us if we do not block ourselves from it. For the musicians, the path of creativity was not well worn. Most of the path was on hidden or esoteric terrain. Creative is also the opposite of destructive, and in this work can be understood as non-destructive or non-violent. By illuminating the healing and spiritual aspects of creative music, I am making explicit a process that was mostly implicit, or at least non-verbal at the time. Sun Ra, beginning in the 1950s, and the AACM, beginning in the 1960s, have articulated their purpose in music, but audiences, especially in America, have been slow to respond. The purpose of this work, therefore, is to communicate the spiritual healing process of creative music to inform a wider audience. The first thing to do in order to approach spiritual healing process was to penetrate the music by actively seeking out its hidden spiritual properties. The listener must become more intimate with the music, as if much more was at stake. I approached the topic as if the musicians, as my elders and as my healers, had prescribed the music for me, as if they had diagnosed an illness and gave me the music as a remedy. In general, my challenge was to give the musicians the same level of authority and deference that I would have given to my pastor, my family practitioner, psychiatrist, or hospital physician. I tried to experience the inner sacred dimension of their music by giving it my full attention. This strategy represents a departure because, as we will see, the United States music and culture industries have tended to neutralize Black music by reserving it for audiences who are diverted, distracted, and inattentive, which prevents them from taking the music seriously. Okay, this is section 2, called Listening for Healing, a case study. My initial contact with this music came in the late 1980s in a record store in Madison, Wisconsin, where I purchased a CD called The Major Works of John Coltrane, 1965, one of my favorite jazz musicians. I took it home in anticipation of more of Coltrane's winning formula of bebop-style jazz, but was shocked and disappointed when instead I perceived a seemingly endless series of unrelated and disorienting musical phrases coming at me from every direction. The primary track, Ascension 1, lasted 40 minutes and led me into occasional climaxes when all the musicians would speak at once, but definitely not together, a kind of cacophonic chorus. I perceived little rhythmic pulse and no sustained melody. The music's radical sound confused, upset, offended, and scared me. Up until that day, I had no idea that Coltrane's music had taken this radical turn. In 1960, he was playing 6 and 7 minute songs in the bebop style, really hard bop. By 1965, he seemed to be ignoring that successful formula. What had happened? Had Coltrane lost his mind? It seemed to me that he had completely forgotten how to play his saxophone. I couldn't stand it anymore, turned the music off, and put the CD on the shelf, a wasted purchase. A few months later, after being reaffirmed by older Coltrane favorites like Blue Train, Kind of Blue, with Miles Davis as the leader, and Giant Steps, 1958, 59, and 60, respectively, I tried to listen to major works again. Still the same verdict, however, and the CD got another year or so on the shelf. Over the next 4 or 5 years, this scenario repeated several times, except that I sometimes put the disc on to have a laugh with my friends. Do you want to hear something weird? I would ask them. It was not until I expanded my horizons by tuning into free format college radio that I began to understand. While listening to WXYC 89.3 FM, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I heard a program on music that sounded akin to Coltrane's major works. No discernible structure, no steady rhythm, no apparent sense of harmony, and no noticeable unity of purpose. It was not only Coltrane who had lost his mind. On WXYC, I learned about dozens of others in the 1960s free jazz movement in New York. At this point, I was forced to pay attention. I could not write off an example like Coltrane's as an anomaly because there were many others. Scores of musicians could not have gone insane all at once. Coltrane's music unnerved me. It was much more secure to assume that Coltrane was crazy than to think that his mysterious music actually meant something significant. What were they all doing? I wanted to know. I approached tentatively. First, I asked my parents, who had passed bebop music on to me as a boy, just as they had come of age listening to bebop in the 1940s and 50s. My mother had even dated a bebop musician when she was young. I asked them what they knew about some of the most well-known free jazz musicians, Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and Albert Ayler, among others. To my surprise, neither of my parents had ever heard of any of them. My parents were not jazz fanatics, but they had been connected to the scene. They appreciated jazz and knew something of its history. They were the right age. Certainly a sound so radically different would have made enough waves to attract the attentions of bebop listeners like my parents over the course of the ensuing 4 decades. But somehow it did not. This too struck me as a phenomenon that needed to be explained. Moreover, even after I found out about the New York free jazz movement, it took additional digging to uncover a related but independent movement in Chicago. By then, I knew there was something more fundamental I should know about this story and began a systematic investigation. After some preliminary research examining the actions of the musicians in the movement, became clear that their story was rich in historical implications. The musicians, in fact, often referred to the importance of myth and history and spent time researching historical issues and expressing viewpoints that would make a difference to Black people. They sought to redress historical inaccuracies, and they tried to synthesize diverse forms of historical Black music, country blues, spirituals, field hollers, gospel, bebop, and others. Through music, they delved into esotericism, spiritualism, and mysticism. Most of their activity, however, is still unknown because it was unspoken, underground, or otherwise veiled from the public eye. Okay, this is section 3 called The Method of Experiential Listening. It took me months to decide on an analytic research strategy that took advantage of my strengths given the available evidence. From earlier meditative and psychedelic experiences in music involving bebop and rock and roll, I had a hunch that I could find out a lot by simply trying to block out distractions and listen to the music itself more carefully over and over in order to penetrate its surface into the space inside the music. This experiential listening practice was an attempt to reproduce Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is a book that an African-American author, I think it came out in the 50s. Experience listening to the music of Louis Armstrong. So this is a quote from Ellison's book. The unheard sounds came through, and each melodic line existed of itself, stood out clearly from all the rest, said its piece, and waited patiently for the other voices to speak. That night, I found myself hearing not only in time, but in space as well. Through repeated and sustained listening under high levels of attention, I believed I could sink into the inner dimensions of this music and then try to translate into words what the musicians were articulating non-verbally. The problem was that my curiosity did not help me establish this daily practice of concentration. I suffered from a paralysis of the will. First, I still had some trouble taking the music seriously. Moreover, I generally did not like the music. It was actually painful for me to listen to it for an extended period. Often, I was not willing to listen, especially when there was so much bebop and rock and roll out there to hear, music that I truly enjoyed. After a period of doubt, though, I convinced myself to face this music. I acceded to an everyday discipline of experiential listening for purposes other than pleasing my senses or my emotions. I took out major works and forced myself to listen to the whole thing many times over, as closely as I could stand, trying to immerse myself in the music. I chose not to exercise the privilege of being able to turn off any music I did not find pleasing. As resources permitted, I bought or borrowed other albums to study. During listening sessions, I usually found my mind recoiling and drifting away. When I could focus, I found that the music often led me into unpleasant emotional states, especially fear, even paranoia. The music was almost torturous in that when I sat down to listen, I was often led into scenarios where I would become convinced of my impending death if I continued to listen. There was a lot of fear, but consistent practice of doubting the paranoid fantasies took me beyond them to show me something valuable. The musicians were capable of playing beautiful, uplifting music, but the truth is sometimes not so beautiful and peaceful. The creative musicians earned my trust by presenting me with a communication that sought to express the truth, regardless of how painful. Once I learned to trust the music more, the experiential listening practice gently and reliably pointed out past errors in my life, errors I had made in judgment or action. These errors were presented to me definitively and conclusively, so I could not deny my responsibility. I had to accept and confess, at least to myself, because it was the truth. I also received nonverbal answers to spiritual questions that I had. Through the process, I learned things about myself and things about the world that I could trust, even if I didn't want to at first. Another thing that helped me learn to trust the music was the general lack of ego projection involved. It was not that the musicians could not convey an individual voice, but it was as though each musician's ego was tuned in to the shared mission of the group. It was obvious that there was a deeper meaning within the music. As I learned to believe in the music more, I also learned to like it, or at least appreciate its spiritual value to heal and to teach. I learned that the music really had structure, rhythm, harmony, and unity of purpose, but they were hidden because they were different than what I had come to expect in music. Both the orchestra and the AACM attempted to form movements to revolutionize the jazz tradition. The orchestra and AACM conspired to play a new kind of music and strategically defended themselves against the jazz establishment, record companies, nightclub owners, and the jazz press. They also tried to teach their practices, especially to young people in the Black community. The musicians in the orchestra and AACM resolved to articulate a lasting alternative to the bebop jazz of the day by learning diverse creative practices, synthesizing them through a do-it-yourself process, and disseminating them through music. In order to understand their music accurately, however, I learned that I too had to employ creative practices. Heightened attention helped me get much closer to the music and the words of these musicians, to dig underneath the surface to the underlying intent. In researching, I needed to venture into unfamiliar territory, behind the veil of the Black musicians' world in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s, and beyond the margins of conventional musical understanding. Listening experientially taught me that creative music presents special problems for more standard historical methods. I used the experiential approach not because the conventional sources are not available, but because they are so easily misinterpreted or taken out of context that they tend to hide the musician's intentions. Perhaps this is why both the orchestra and the AACM have been elusive in allowing outsiders to study with them in the first place. Scholars have not been willing to get close enough to the music, to be vulnerable to it. Heightened attention was the best way I found to approach the music and thereby ascertain the musician's historical intent. This method gave me the key to unlock the hidden code and translate their intentions into words. Still, even with this esoteric approach, my words can only be a bridge. My writing is intended to inspire readers to experience creative music on their own by starting to listen under heightened attention. In this work, I will argue that making contact with this heightened awareness has been the primary project of the creative musicians groups in Chicago. They sought first to tap into a heightened awareness in themselves, then to induce it in their audiences. Even short-term contact with this higher awareness requires the ego to be quieted. Sustaining contact demanded that the musicians make long-term personal sacrifices of worldly desires and emotions for the sake of the higher purpose of spiritual healing. The jazz establishment offered good money, high status, and the excitement of show business. The musicians needed to manifest spiritual power to overcome these desires in order to search for a music of higher intention. Unfortunately, most people have never heard of, much less heard, creative music. Even if they have, they probably have not learned how to experience it optimally with heightened awareness through concentration and daily practice. As a result of my own listening practice, I have come to believe that creative music can be beneficial to anyone who takes the music seriously. If we adopt a patience mindset, if we try to abstract the sound from the voice of our own egos, if we sustain focus, then we start to hear the inner dimensions of the music. Creative music's full potential requires heightened, disciplined participation on the part of listeners, stilling our movements, thoughts, and judgments. We must move deeply into the sound, not pulled back to everyday consciousness by vocalizing thoughts. The challenge is to immerse ourselves so completely that we temporarily lose track of our egos and tune into the different rhythms, melodies, and harmonies of the creative world, space. Okay, now the next section is called repetition and representation and repetition. But I believe we will start getting into that tomorrow. So we're going to stop there for today and take over tomorrow with section 4, representation and repetition, when we return. So thanks for tuning in today and have a great day.